Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here because I think it's the most important community in the industry for us to collaborate with. And it's good that we are having this dialogue and the opportunity also to present a little bit the industry perspective. To start with, I would like to look a little bit into the history. And usually I don't like to talk too much about myself, but I think in this specific case, it might make sense. You may know that I already started to build my first ontologies already almost 30 years ago, early days, not with OWL, but with predecessor languages. And since then, I have been involved in the ontology community from the academic and later on also from the industry perspective. In 2005, I joined the industry, first at Novartis, and then in 2013, I left Novartis and went to Roche. But at the end of the day, the core of my activities has always been the same, trying to bring ontologies into the industry at scale. And yeah, in 2016, and these are the two events that I have here on the first slide, I was invited to a conference, a workshop at the Amble EBI in Kingston, where we were speaking about the practical use of biomedical ontologies in the industry above all, but also in the academia. And I titled it The Strategic Importance of Biomedical Ontologies, where everybody says yes. And then I had a fine print say, and no one really cares. But this was the situation in 2016. And to the same point, I also was invited by Michel Dumontier to speak at the Biontology Special Interest Group meeting in Orlando, 2016. And I put together a couple of points that were still valid at this time around biomedical ontologies and their usage in the industry. So I think at this time, people who worked in this realm were more or less niche players. So we are kind of being part of the organization, but working on in fancy corners. At a strategic level, I think when we applied ontologies, it was mainly partial solutions. So just looking into a specific area of the organization and eventually trying to apply ontologies for a specific project, but that was not sustainable. Then I think at this time, there was also still a huge challenge around technology, in particular about the notation languages that we have been using, RDF and OWL, and the corresponding triple stores that were available. And last but not least, there was also a perception issue because at this time, data and data quality was a kind of a strangely neglected topic. Looking into the organization, there was missing ownership of data, poor interest in the business to take care of data quality, make a data strategy, make data management sustainable. And when we did something, then it came more from the regulatory space, so from CDISC or the authorities, where we had to set up something and it only worked with pressure. And last but not least, there also was a range issue because even though we are really huge organizations, so at this time, around 80 to 90,000 employees globally, only a few people really understood or understand the topic. So on the one hand, at least from my perspective, also being a little bit biased, there was a clear objective and urgent need for bringing ontologies into the industry at scale, but there was poor adoption. And now this has dramatically changed. And it was really around the years 2016, 2018, because new words were coming around. There was this idea of a new industrial revolution, Industry 4.0, also coined here as Pharma 4.0, around terms like digitalization, Internet of Things, lab automation, advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, big data, data science. And this all of a sudden was driven by really the executive level of organizations like at Novartis, by Vas, who was the CEO, but also at Roche Genentech, we had the same pattern. All of a sudden, our executives realized that data are no longer a byproduct of our business processes. Our business processes are data-driven. And this really flipped the coin to a certain extent. And I really like this slide that I have taken from Rick van Bruggen from Neo4j that looks into the mega trends that we have as a part of the digital transformation journey, like data-driven drug discovery in our domain, personalized health. You may know that personalized healthcare is one of the very, very important hot topics in our industry. Enhanced decision-making in our realm, it's also about informed decision-making. Massive data integration at scale, providing 360-degree views of any kind of information type, And I think last but not least, AI and machine learning, where you can do any kind of insight generation. What typically we tend to forget is that all of these megatrends build on connected data at the center. And the connected data, in essence, has to reflect two different dimensions. One is FAIR, so this findable, accessible, interoperable, reusability. I don't think I have to repeat this too frequently because everybody knows it these days. And the other dimension is data quality. But if we look into this objective to provide this really unified, semantically rich, annotated, and also harmonized data at the center, we need data standards. And data standards typically are defined by terminologies, ontologies, and data models. So looking at also in the way how we are working with data, which also is related a little bit to the perception of the value. I think for a very, very long time, we only have looked at the visible costs for data management, like what is necessary to create a data asset in terms of FTEs, what materials do you have to procure, like samples, reagents, compounds, also the infrastructure, the buildings, the machines and everything. But there are all these unplanned invisible costs like ETL processing, searching, accessing data, data cleansing, and you may know this frequently cited fact that data scientists spend 80% of their time on this one here. So there's also a huge cost block that you need to address. And again, I think data standardization, harmonization based on the FAIR principles and on using ontologies at scale is key here. So now looking a little bit more into the Roche Genentech environment, we have had a 4 or 5 year program, which has been called EDIS, Enhanced Data and Insight Sharing, where we created what we call the Roche Data Commons. This, in essence, is a 5-layered approach to reorganize our data management. And at the bottom layer, you have infrastructure. This is where the data assets physically reside on servers, on cloud infrastructure, you name it. The layer 2 is where we manage our scientific data assets, where we have our data set catalogs, our workflow languages. And the layer 3 is very interesting and very important because this is a layer that we called harmonized data access points. And these harmonized data access points are organized around information types like adverse events, clinical study, expression, flow cytometry, medical history, patient sample study, and so on and so forth. And this is, again, something which is really, really very close to the way how we organize our knowledge in ontologies and terminologies. Then we are building integrated data sets on layer 4, and finally, our applications reside at layer 5. Please note that it's really flipping the coin a little bit. So I think typically organizations think in terms of applications that contain data. Now we are thinking in terms of data that eventually is materialized in applications. And on the left bar here, which is vertical, you see the reference data services. So the reference data services, which consists of terminologies, ontologies, metadata, and models, also represent the structure of the data. This is the key that holds all of this architecture together. And this is also where the biomedical ontologies really come into play. So we have built a couple of internal resources, which are fully integrated in a semantic technology stack. So they are by themselves FAIR. And these are the typical ingredients that you would need as an industry company to set up your capabilities to work and synergize ontologies. So the first one is being able to manage your terminologies if you wish. So these are different term sets. And I think you wouldn't see any surprises here in terms of the organization. So you have your concept types like indications. You have the information about specific indications like synonyms. You have a definition. You have a life cycle. Of course, you have a uniform resource identifier, a GUPRI. We work with cross-references, so we also apply ontologies mapping. The unique selling proposal that we have is that the way how we disseminate this in the usage or the application environment is by providing every application a partition in our system where they get exactly what they need in terms of the terminologies and ontologies. So this is really fully custom tailored. And here you see, for example, a CRM system where we manage the trademark names for the US together with the market authorized indications. We have so far hooked up more than 80 productive applications across all functions and sites, which is a very, very broad range. And please note that all of those use our uniform resource identifiers. You need to do the same at the level of metadata. So we also have built a metadata registry, where you can see on the left side, this is a dictionary of metadata elements. And you can use these metadata elements to describe data set models. In essence, what you see here, for example, in the browser is the demographics domain, where you have a set of variables that describe what you want to capture in your data set model. And then you can also, for the variables themselves, you can describe the policy by having more properties like what is the value domain. In this specific case, it is a terminology for countries, the multiplicity is single valued, and whether it's a required or an optional variable. This is also related to ISO 11179 metadata registry. And last but not least, this is the next layer. Going from metadata registry, you also then use these various URIs entities to build them into data domains and purpose-driven ontologies. So we are not going for full-blown ontologies and elaborated ontologies as the ones which are mentioned in the program of this workshop. We rather go into providing data domain tailored ontologies, and we use them as a kind of a template to build the instantiated knowledge graphs. So here is something that we have done for a therapeutic area, where you see a typical, say, concepts, top-level concepts like tissue types, cell types, gene products, transcripts, genes, and how they relate. And all of these various entities are, again, fully harmonized. They are fair. They are represented by URIs. They are linked to standard, linked to ontologies. We instantiate them with data, and then we are able to run federated queries across data domains and across different data repositories. So going back to the data commons, the actual FAIRification happens here at layer 2 and 3. So this is where we apply our reference data services to inject the semantic seeds, if you wish, and prepare everything semantically from terminologies to models to ontologies. And at layer 4 and 5, for the integration and the applications, we just use this knowledge for dereferencing. So if we have to do transformations between layer 2 and 3 and layer 4 and 5, then we were not successful with our FAIRification efforts. Looking now into the FAIR data principles and how we apply them. This is a slide I've taken from my colleague Olivier Roche. I think there are two points. So one is the human aspect, where you have, where you can say the ability for a scientist or data consumer to find, access, and understand the data without the presence of the data owner indicates that your data are fair. But I think more importantly, it's also being about machine actionable, so that a machine can find and use the data and make semantic sense out of it. What I currently see, and this is also a little bit of a concern, is that there's a little bit of a dilution of the FAIR principles. And in many, many cases, people claim they are fair, but they are actually not. So just would like to emphasize here that FAIR is not primarily about the that, so that I can find something, that I can access something. It is above all about the how. How can I find something and how can I access something? And this is exactly called out by the FAIR metrics, which we apply, by the way, in our domain at 3 levels. So we apply it for our data, we apply it for our applications, and we apply it for our services. I will go a little bit into the details around the services in a second. Just to mention that you can find the FAIR maturity indicators, for example, in the FAIR toolkit that we have done at the Pistoia Alliance. And very importantly, I think if you want to be fair, you are intrinsically in the world of ontologies and semantic technologies, at least when it comes to respecting the FAIR principles, where, for example, F1 says that your data and metadata is assigned a separate global universal and identifier, which is unique and which is persistent, and that you should also ground your metadata in shared vocabularies, which are usually coming out of this community. I mean, there's more around this, but I also assume that most of you are familiar with the FAIR principles. But that's this really goes very, very deep in the way how you set up your data strategy and how you establish your data management. People tend to forget about this. And then you can also do a so-called FAIR assessment, where you use the FAIR principles, the maturity indicators, the 14 or 15, And you can either do it as a human person or you can do it as a machine. There are also different approaches here. And a common approach here is this 5-star rating, where for each of the dimensions you get a score from 0 to 5 stars. And then you also have a combined score above about the 4 dimensions. So now looking a little bit into a practical implementation, I think I also mentioned that APIs need to be fair. And this is an example I've taken from our environment, where we have 3 different systems: the harmonized data access point for clinical studies. We also have one in research. PRED stands for Pharma Research and Development, and our clinical standards repository. As you can see here in the JSON output of these systems, if they provide a service, you see a study indication, which is non-small cell lung cancer. This one here, you have a target disease, non-small cell lung cancer. And here you have a therapeutic indication, which is carcinoma, non-small cell lung. So now you're back again into the game of doing mapping and merging of your data, because these APIs are not harmonized. And there's a fantastic way to harmonize and standardize APIs using semantic technologies, using ontologies, which is called JSON-LD. And so you also leverage on the semantic infrastructure you're having. And the simple rule here is that both for your data and for your metadata, you're just sending URIs. So you're creating reference not with strings, but with URIs. And this typically, or is rather easily, can be translated also into RDF triples. So here, for example, we have the concept for non-small cell lung cancer with a definition. We have a contributor. Of course, it has its own identifier. We are using identifiers, internal identifiers. It has a status in the life cycle and everything. What's interesting that you also send the semantics of the attributes as a context together with your JSON. So just going back, you know what a contributor is, you know what RORA is, you know what definition is, because it's all defined here in the context. And again, it's resolvable. So now applying this strategy here to our APIs, what you can see is that even though I'm using different labels here to talk about an indication, if I send JSON-LD and I use the identifier for this indication, I can just neglect the label and I can integrate instantaneously without any effort, no transformation needed, by just merging here at the URI or the identifier level. And interestingly, the same applies at the metadata level. I've also seen that the attributes in the JSON have different labels, but in our metadata terminology, in our metadata dictionary, they all refer to the same identifier. So I can also instantaneously map here the data attributes. And we have a very, very good implementations of this approach, for example, in our data catalog, where we manage our data assets in the organization. It's working very, very nicely when you have data contracts that are based on JSON-LD representation. And last but not least, that's for us from the, say, also the semantic community, you can serialize it again as triples, and then you can also load it in layer 4 and layer 5 into data marts, or put it into some analytics tools. So now looking a little bit into the last topic I want to cover before we go into the question and answers is about the topic today. So actually, if you look into the biomedical domain, we have a lot of resources. And just looking into FAIRsharing, and this is a screenshot I've taken 2 or 3 years ago. You see, first of all, when you filter on the standards tab, you have 1,299 entries. It's, by the way, today it's 1,541. We have 1,541 standards or things which are resources which are classified as standards in our domain, and it's growing. So we have a proliferation and a fragmentation of standards. And interestingly as well is that this FAIRsharing catalog is done manually. So it's also about, are the resources that we're having here, are they machine actionable? Are they fair? Are they easy to crawl and to integrate? So I think there is still a lot of work to do in our, say, FAIR landscape. And also looking into a tool like BioPortal, which is maintained by our colleagues at Stanford University. I think it's one of the business critical resources for the entire community, including the industry. You see, if I search for something like malignant melanoma, I get matches in 24 ontologies. So for this element, I have 24 different resources. And then we start all the efforts around mapping between meta identifiers, SNOMED, Now looking into the FAIR data principles, and I'm possibly a little bit exaggerating here, I would, in an ideal world, I would just have one identifier for one entity in the world, right? This is also data metadata are assigned separate globally universal identifier. So I read this bidirectional. I mean, of course, it would be good, say, if we could converge here and try to reduce the number of resources. And a very good, and also looking to the same issue at the level of metadata or data sets. This is a representation from CDISC or Odyssey, where you see you're talking here about the same, in essence, about the same data collection. The demographics domain here is called patient model. And then you have different representations for the same thing. For example, unique subject identifier has a different name and a different label, as in Odyssey, where it's called person ID. But at the end of the day, according to the description definition, it's the same. Same applies to the date of birth and sex, age unit. So at the end of the day, we have too many different models. We have two different variables. We have two different values, too many resources. And we are spending a lot of work and everything to consolidate this. And possibly, if we look into synergies, I'm thinking very much about convergence. Possibly, we can really start to converge more so that our space gets manageable. I think this space, at least in my opinion, has got out of control to a large extent. And a good example to me, and I would call it also the winner takes it all, is the Cellosaurus. Of course, when you look into cell lines, you have still a couple of repositories that contain cell lines, like FO or the CLO, but the Cellosaurus really has emerged to the single point of reference with almost 130,000 cell lines, most of them being human. So you have an excellent coverage. And then also, if you look into the descriptions, you have this unique identifier. The annotations are really of high quality. It's exhaustively curated. You have rich metadata, and it's also linked into the resource identification initiative, where you could then unambiguously identify a cell line by this identifier. So why not take a similar approach for other information types in our community? Instead of building new resources, let's try to consolidate, to harmonize, and reduce our efforts as a community, because to me, this is the prerequisite of success. If we, I mean, also in my team, we're losing a lot of time in mapping reading definitions, trying to harmonize, running also into issues of some of the existing resources. And I think we need to be more productive and slimmer here. So having said this, and this is my last slide, instead of conclusions, I think we should work towards an open public-private semantic infrastructure of FAIR applications, services, and data. Applications should be based on FAIR data models and metadata models, for example, DCAT for data catalogs. You should have open interfaces to bring in FAIR terminologies, ontologies, and FAIR data schemata. This is something that is not at all seen in the vendor space. And of course, open interfaces for data access, model readout, and semantically enabled microservices, which goes to the next point. But in many cases, our approaches are old-fashioned, where we have still connectors and integration layers. I think we can natively get access to data from applications if you use JSON-LD. Services, smart APIs, as mentioned before, semantically harmonized with FAIR APIs, where the data values and attributes have also global, unique, persistent, and resolvable identifiers. And we establish data contracts based on JSON-LD that allow for seamless data integration, where you don't have any transformation. And it's working. We have it in place in our company, and it's really exciting to see this. Last but not least, metadata and data are represented with semantic standards. Biomedical ontologies should converge. Ideally, we should have shared engineering principles, shared semantics, and a consolidated reference base. And this is also something where public and commercial content providers ideally should adhere to FAIR principles and implement the data standards. So this is the end of my presentation. I also would like to make you aware of a presentation tomorrow from Samantha, where we're really having a kind of an example how we are working on a chunk of this public-private semantic infrastructure. In this specific case, it's about FAIR bioassay annotations. And with this, I'm done. Thanks for the attention, and open for questions.
Thank you, Martin. And this was an amazing overview. Really amazing. I didn't know the Roche infrastructure that you guys built. So we are kind of at the time already 8:40. But there's one question. Maybe you can answer it really quickly. From Martin Krallinger, how do you deal with interoperability issues when dealing with non-English ontologies or non-English data, particularly in case of clinical data sources? So what implication does it have for harmonization? Maybe you can briefly mention this. I mean, you probably can speak to it, you know, being in Germany or being in Switzerland, right? And speaking German, I guess, quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think so far it has not yet been the most important topic, but it's really coming as we are working in many countries, and we need to look into the various nomenclatures. A good example is indication, right? For example, there's a German indication which is called pseudogroup, and it simply doesn't exist as such in French or in English. So now what do we do in this specific case?
Yeah.
So it's an upcoming topic. We are looking into this, but unfortunately, I wouldn't say that we already have a solution to this in place. But would be very interested to share resources here, to collaborate and to converge at all levels. And last remark, I think the industry as such is now really prepared to collaborate, to share. We don't want to stay in our corner. We want to be a part of the community, contribute, and also try to put as much of our work into the public domain as possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Martin